Hey guys, we're here today in Valheim, and we are taking a look at how status effects work in the game. In this video, we're only addressing the combat effects being burning, frost, poison, and spirit damage, since all of your non-combat effects like rested, resting, or corpse run all clearly define and state what they do in the buff menu. We're going to go through each effect individually, discussing how it operates, and as we go through, there will be timestamps, and those timestamps will be split up into the player's effect and the enemy's effect. For example, it will say player poison or enemy poison. Anytime we're referencing player, it will be any effect that we apply to the enemy, and when we reference enemy, it will be effects the enemy applies to us. We will start out with fire, or the burning status effect. Every instance of the burning status effect in Valheim lasts for 5 seconds, and this is regardless if it's applied by the player or the enemy, and it does not matter what source it's coming from, it will be 5 seconds of burning. You cannot stack up multiple effects of burning on the same target, and they will simply override each other and start a new stack of 5 seconds with a new amount of damage. It is very simple to figure out how much fire damage you will be dealing to the enemy. If you take a look at something like the fire arrow, you can see that it gives you a window of damage for fire. The fire arrow deals a maximum of 22 fire damage, so if you were to hit an enemy with a fire arrow and deal 22 fire damage to it, it will deal that 22 damage over 5 seconds, which will come out to 4.4 damage a tick, since the burning status effect has 1 tick of damage every second. I have come across no indications at all that rain affects player fire damage, and shooting wet mobs does not seem to have any effect on the duration or the overall damage. However, there are some enemies that are immune to fire or resistant to it, with the obvious one being Surtlings. This is not a video on enemy resistances, and we may touch on that in a later video, but be aware that certain status effects may be more effective in certain situations. Now we'll move on into enemy fire effects. The only things I'm aware of that deal fire damage in Valheim is a Surtling, and then the Fueling Torchbearers and the Fueling Shaman. When an enemy hits you with fire, it will work the exact same way and deal the total damage over 5 seconds. And you can see approximate of the damage each enemy will deal with their fire attacks up on the screen now. If you were to use barley wine to negate some of the fire damage and give yourself fire resistance, it will negate 50% of the damage but take nothing off the total duration. Rain and being wet does affect the player's resistance to fire effects and will wipe away the fire debuff immediately, but rapidly reduce the wet debuff. So if you are currently standing in water or standing in rain, you can pretty much be nearly immune to fire. Another important thing to note with fire is the overall damage is mitigated by armor class. So if you were to equip yourself in high level padded armor, you can negate a large portion of the fire damage coming at you and survive much longer. Now we can move on to player poison effects. There are 3 items in the game that I'm aware of that deal poison damage to enemies, being the Draugr Fang Bow, the Ooze Bomb, and the Poison Arrow. Every instance of poison applied by the player will last 6 seconds, and just like fire, it will divide the total damage across those 6 ticks of damage. The Ooze Bomb can feel like it lasts a lot more than 6 seconds of poison because the cloud will last for 10 seconds, so it will deal 10 seconds of poison damage to anything standing in it, and then last for 6 seconds after the poison cloud dissipates. So the poison effect still lasts 6 seconds, although the cloud lasts considerably longer. The Ooze Bomb does not display its poison damage, but I have ran it through quite a few tests and it seems to be about 5 damage per tick. Which means if you can get an enemy to stay in the cloud for the entire 16 seconds, it will deal 80 damage to everything in it. I have seen the damage tick for higher than this at certain points, or maybe a little bit lower, but I can't pinpoint exactly what is changing the damage output, and I have to say about 95% of the time it was just a straight 5 damage per tick. And a somewhat exception to the 6 second duration is the Draugr Fang Bow. It lasts 6 seconds of poison damage at max level, however if it's a lower quality than 4, it does last slightly less time, and it applies slightly less poison damage. And just like fire, poison cannot be stacked up or increase the duration by applying multiple stacks. When you hit something with poison, it will simply overwrite the previous effect. But when those effects are applied with the same attack, they can stack, such as using the Draugr Fang Bow to apply a poison arrow. This will stack both poison effects, stack their damage, however their duration will move to 9 seconds as opposed to 6, and tick for a longer time. So if you're fighting multiple large enemies and you'd like to poison each one individually, and not have to reapply poisons quite as often, using the Draugr Fang Bow along with the poison arrows can be a very good combo. Just like fire, there are multiple enemies that are either resistant or immune to poison damage, with some obvious ones being things like blobs or oozes. But again, we are not getting into all enemy weaknesses in this video. Now we're on to enemy poison effects. The different enemies that deal poison damage are blobs, oozers, leeches, rancid remains, and the Grey Dwarf Shaman. Poisons applied by these enemies is something you will have to adapt to and gain a better understanding of over time, since they do not all last for 5 seconds like fire. The poison durations for each enemy varies between the enemy and the star level of the enemy. You can see the rough overall damage of the poison dealt and the duration of the poison for each enemy up here on the screen now. The approximate damage number I'm giving you here on the screen would just be divided by the seconds that it lasts to get the damage per tick. For example, a 0-star Grey Dwarf Shaman with 26 damage over 12 seconds would deal about 2.1 damage a tick. Poison damage is not mitigated in any way by armor, which is a primary reason the swamp can be so dangerous, because it is purely off your health and food situation, and you can do nothing to mitigate the damage from poison with what you wear. However, the poison mead makes up for this, since it is the most powerful mead in the game against its respective effect. You can see that both the fire and the frost mead say resistant versus fire or frost, and the poison says very resistant. The poison mead will reduce the duration of the poison by 50%, cutting the duration in half, and it will also reduce the damage in half. The stacking of these effects is incredibly noticeable, and is essentially dropping the poison to 25% of its potency. So if you took the blob's 60 overall damage over 18 seconds and halved it to 30 damage over 18 seconds, it cuts the tick damage in half. And then what the mead does by cutting the duration in half as well is cuts the overall amount of damaging ticks that you deal with. Meaning you would get hit by the blob for roughly 1.6 damage for 9 seconds, totaling up to about 15 damage, which is 1/4 of its base 60 damage. Now we can move on to frost effects. The player frost effects discussion here is going to be incredibly short. There is no damage over time with the frost effects, and it's all dealt right away, which means it's calculated exactly like any blunt, slash, or pierce damage that we've dealt with before. And then the frost effect applied to the enemies is really hard to monitor because the particle effects are not that noticeable and it can be hard to track. And through my testing, every mob is reacting to it differently. The Grey Dwarfs is lasting nearly 16 to 18 seconds, where the Fuelings are lasting only a few seconds and the Locks are immune entirely. The Frost Arrows and Frostner are the only two frost items that I know of for the player to use, and both of these are some of the top weapons to use to take down most of any enemy. So I can tell you they're entirely worth using, but we are not going to go through every enemy's resistance to frost in this video, as it would make it entirely too long. And now we can move on to how the enemy applies frost to our character. Not including Motor, there's only one enemy in the game that applies frost to the character, which is the Drake. But this is one of the most dangerous enemies in the game, especially when we're talking about base rates. You can see the different damage numbers for each star quality of Drake on the screen here. I went through quite a bit of testing with the frost mechanic, and I came to some very interesting finds that we'll get to in just a moment. First off, an important note to make is that the base duration for frost applied by any star quality of Drake is 15 seconds. It'll slow you down massively at the beginning, and as the timer moves to 0, your character will get slowly faster and faster. And there's been a big topic of discussion on whether or not frost resistance stacks. Although with fire and poison, you only have the mead to build resistance to it, with frost, we have the wolf pelt cloak, the Locks cape, the wolf armor chest piece, and the mead. So the question of whether or not they stack is a huge one. I can tell you that they do not. Only one effect of frost resistance will happen at a time. And having frost resistance on your character will cut the damage the Drake deals to you in half, but it will not affect the frost timer at all, and it will still remain at 15 seconds. Now the reason that it gets confusing, and some people have believed that frost resistance does stack, because just like fire, frost is affected by your overall armor, and your armor will mitigate not only the damage, but also the timer of the frost debuff. The most common situation is that people built a wolf cape first, or used frost resistance mead, and then later on in the game got wolf armor, and assumed that the effect stacked because you were getting a lower amount of frost and a lower amount of damage. But in reality, it's the armor class from the wolf chest armor that is lowering these times and damage. If you put on a full set of padded armor, you can actually negate both the timer and the damage by a large amount, and not need any frost resistance at all. If you were to wear padded armor and stack it with some frost resistance, you would barely notice that the Drake was hitting you. But the more interesting thing that I found out, which originally made it really difficult to test, not knowing this myself, is that your max hit points affect how long the frost debuff lasts on your character. You can first see these kick in at around 90 hit points. The frost debuff will drop from 15 seconds to about 12 or 13. This moves all the way up until you're at 275 with blood pudding, Locks meat pie, and serpent stew, and the frost debuff is only lasting 4 seconds, and this is with 0 resistance and 0 armor on. It's important to keep in mind that although your max hit points lowers the debuff duration, it does not lower the damage. So in best practice, it's good to mix the armor class, the frost resist, and the overall hit points together. If I was equipped with the highest hit points I could with blood pudding, Locks meat pie, and serpent stew, along with padded armor and frost resistance, even a 2-star Drake would be hitting me for very low damage numbers, and the debuff duration would be inconsequential. So you're going to see some huge disparity in numbers when you're dealing with drakes depending on what armor you're currently wearing and what food you're currently eating, along with whether or not you have resistance to frost at the moment. But just as a general rule, if you're going to the mountains, the better armor you have on and the better food you have with you, the less hassle it's going to be. Now the last effect we're going to get to is only for the player, as I don't know of any enemies that deal any type of spirit damage, and this one should be pretty quick too. There are a few items in the game that deal spirit damage for the player. Spirit operates slightly different than the other damaging effects, and it ticks part of its dot every half a second, as opposed to 1 second intervals. But it only lasts for 4 seconds. So you will get 7 damaging ticks out of that 4 second span, which can make spirit seem like it's dealing damage at a very quick pace when you're fighting undead. But the nice thing is that every spirit weapon we deal with in the game tells us its overall damage output in the tooltips. The important thing to note with spirit damage is it does not apply to every enemy in the game, and the enemy must be weak to it, such as skeletons or Draugr. The enemy being weak to spirit just means it can be applied with the spirit damage, and not that it takes an increased damage from it, like every other weakness in the game. So you will be only getting what's in the tooltip and not an increased damage output when you hit something with a spirit weapon. Alright guys, that was all the status effect info that I could think of to put in this video. Hopefully I didn't miss anything or miss a question that you had yourself, and hopefully this video was helpful to you and not too boring for you. Let me know down in the comments the hardest status effect for you to deal with and fight against, and if any of the info in this video was new for you and will help you combat it better. Thanks for watching, I will see you next time.